Hello there. Welcome to this Paleo-Zoo-Keeper Special. My name is Austin. What if? That's always been one of the biggest questions when imagining anything. Like, what if Abraham Lincoln was an assassin? What if the Nazis won World War II? What if it wasn't Christopher Columbus that discovered America at that time, but the Chinese did? And so on and so forth. That's also part of my video as well, my channel as well. Like, what if, we resurrected extinct species? How we take care of them, and what would it be like an invasive species? But then there's always one what if scenario that I've always wondered about for a long time. What if the Australian megafauna survived up to recent times? How would that go? How would we deal with them? And that's something that I've always wondered. And in this special, we are going to explore that what if scenario.
We all know that Australia has a wide menagerie of very strange and bizarre creatures that are pretty familiar to us. Like koala, wombat, platypus, emu, cassowary, and kangaroo. There are even creatures that did live on mainland Australia, but now only survive on nearby islands, like the Tasmanian devil, or even those that have died off pretty recently, like the famous thylacine or Tasmanian tiger. But Australia used to have creatures that were even weirder than them. Like I said, Australia had a lot of bizarre megafauna during the Ice Age, and in this part of the video, we'll cover some of them here. But I won't be able to cover all of them in this part of the video, but other varieties will be mentioned here and there throughout the video, so keep an eye out for that. So, let's start with our first one, with perhaps one of the most well-known megafauna of the Ice Age, the mighty Diprotodon.
The Diprotodon was a giant relative of the wombat that was roughly between 10 to 13 feet long, standing in at 6 feet tall, and weighs in around 2.5 to 3.5 tons, similar to size and weight, with the largest living species of rhinos, and even to that of small Asian elephants. This makes the Diprotodon the largest marsupial, a mammal that carried its young in a pouch that had ever lived. Scientists believe that the Diprotodon lived in herds and were the only known marsupial that would migrate, much like the wildebeest in the African savanna or bison in the American plains.
Along with the giant relative of the wombat, we've also had giant kangaroos too. One of them is basically part of the family of the short-faced kangaroos. The most common and most famous one is known as the Procoptodon.
This genus of kangaroo can range in height from over 3 feet tall to almost 9 feet tall. The first thing you would notice about this genus of kangaroo is that their faces are short compared to that of modern kangaroos, hence their nickname of short-faced kangaroos. This is so that they can have stronger jaws for their diet, which is leaves and twigs from trees and shrubs, rather than having the grassy diet of modern kangaroos. And they would use their arms to pull branches down, like the ground sloths of the Americas. But the next weirdest thing about this variety of kangaroo is their legs and feet. Not only do they only have one toe on each of their feet, unlike the 3 in modern roos, but they actually walk rather than hop. When they walk, they literally look like they're walking like a T-Rex in Jurassic Park. So basically, when they walk, they did the dinosaur.
Mammals aren't the only ones who got in on the megafauna fun. Birds even got onto this too. One such species in particular would be the Jenny ornis. The Jenny ornis is a flightless species of bird that stood between 6.5 to 7 feet tall and weighed between 485 to 530 pounds. Despite the appearance that's similar to like emu or an ostrich, Jenny ornis and other Thunderbirds, that as their family is called, are actually more closely related to waterfowl, like ducks and geese. And like ducks and geese, Geniotis and its relatives seem to prefer to feast on aquatic plants and live by in bodies of water as a result of this. So wetlands and swamps would also be a preferable habitat for them as well. Back to the mammals, another giant wombat relative would be Phasalonis gigas. Now, a little disclaimer. Unlike the Diprotodon, which is basically just a relative of the wombats, Phasalonis is basically a true wombat that is pretty much a meter tall and long, basically 3.28 feet long and tall, and weighs around 450 pounds. This is basically around the size and weight of a grizzly bear. At least a pretty generic one. This wombat is found in arid and semi-arid areas, almost like the marsupial's answer to the camel or wild donkey. As well as mammals and birds, there's a reptile that was also in the landscape as a large herbivore. Despite its appearances, the Myolania is not a dinosaur, and it's technically not a tortoise, but a variety of land turtle that was around 8 feet long, 4.5 feet tall, and weighed around 1,000 pounds, although some species within the genus were smaller. With the horns that the Myolania possess, they are unable to retract their heads in their shells. However, their spiked tails may make use as a defensive weapons against predators, or even with each other during the mating season. As well as Australia, this species of turtles has been found on offshore islands such as New Caledonia, Lord Howe Island, and possibly Vanuatu. Even the already bizarre monotremes or egg-laying mammals got into the megafauna party. One such monotreme was a large echidna called Moriglossus. This spiny anteater was 1 meter or 3.3 feet long, 2 feet tall, and weighed around 66 pounds, making it around the size of a modern-day wombat or a Labrador retriever. Now, while this is not much, it makes it the largest monotreme that ever lived, especially one that terrorized the ants and termites of the outback. Now, with all these different varieties of prey, there are definitely quite a lot of varieties of predators to hunt them. One of these predators is one that's actually very familiar to us, but most wouldn't even think that it would ever be in Australia naturally. That all too familiar predator was the infamous Komodo dragon. The largest lizard that lives today, the Komodo dragon can grow to a length of 10 feet long, although they're typically around 8 feet long, and weigh around up to 200 pounds, although some males can reach up to 300 pounds, and females generally around 150 pounds. These reptiles were, and still are, terrifying, with bones underneath their skin that act like chainmail, and even have a venomous bite that would help make their prey bleed out and die. Then they would go after prey that range from rat size to even water buffalo size. Scientists believe that they disappeared from Australia around 50,000 years ago, now only surviving on a handful of Indonesian islands. While the Komodo dragon is the largest living lizard, it is definitely not the largest lizard that ever lived. That title belongs to the mighty Megalania. This monstrous lizard was far larger than the Komodo dragon, but no one's completely sure on just how large it was exactly. This is due to the fact that the fossils of the reptile are incomplete and fragmentary. Fossil record tends to be like that after all. With what we've been able to gather from the remains, our best guesses is that the Megalania's length was basically between 18 and 26 feet long, and weighed between 700 to even 4,000 pounds, or that's 2 tons. Regardless of this uncertainty, we are definitely sure that it was definitely larger than the Komodo dragon, and if it had the similar armor and venom as its smaller relative, it was definitely a bigger danger than the Komodo dragon as well. As we go about the predators that lived in Australia during the Ice Age, we must not forget the most famous marsupial predator that lived on the continent and at least survived up to the 1930s in Tasmania. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, was a carnivorous marsupial that resembled a canid and had an ecology similar to that of medium-sized canids like jackals, but more recently, probably more similar to like cats at the same size, like lynx, being more ambush than pursuit. The thylacine, along with the Tasmanian devil, disappeared from the continent around 3,000 years ago, only to survive in Tasmania until the last individual thylacine died in captivity on September 7th, 1936. But obviously, the Tasmanian devil is still alive, but they suffered their own ordeals, but that's another story. It was thought that the thylacine might have died off from the continent due to a combination of climate change, human activities, which led to habitat destruction, disease, overhunting, and competition with the wild dog, the dingo. Another marsupial predator that prowled the outback during the Ice Age was the Thylacoleo, or the pouched lion. Despite the name, this predator was more like the size of a leopard, being 5 feet long, 2.5 feet tall at the shoulder, and weigh between 223 to 287 pounds, while some would reach up to 353 pounds. Lived a bit like a solitary jaguar than a social lion, and is actually more closely related to wombats and koalas than even to the carnivorous marsupials living today. However, this does not mean that it was an insignificant predator. This predator was robust, with flexible arms that can wrestle large prey to the ground with their opposable thumbs that possess retractable claws. And while its jaws might not have canines, their roller-like teeth are still pretty effective, and their jaw power actually overpowers any modern big cat. Interestingly, it turns out that the kangaroo family also brought a contender for a predator, or at least a predator of a sort, through a species called Propleopus. This marsupial is most closely related to the modern musky rat kangaroos, a small kangaroo relative that lives much like a rat, having an omnivorous diet that consists of fruit, fungi, and insects. While the modern musky rat kangaroo weighs around 500 grams and is comparable to the size of a guinea pig, the Propleopus weighs around 154 pounds and is comparable to the size of a modern gray kangaroo. And mind you, why I did say predator, it has a diet. It's basically like a kangaroo that has a diet like that of a raccoon. Being an omnivore, having a diet consisting of fruit, fungi, eggs, and small vertebrates, from small mammals to birds and even reptiles. When it comes to reptilian predators, one such predator that anyone who knows about Australia and was a kid in the 90s that reigned supreme in Australia is the crocodile. Today, we have the large saltwater crocodile and the smaller freshwater crocodile. While these two crocodiles are different in size, the salty is significantly larger than the freshy, 17 to 23 feet versus 7 to 10 feet, and in diet, freshwater crocs are primarily fish eaters, whereas saltwater crocs can eat any prey, even feral pigs and sharks. They both have to stay near the water to survive. There is one crocodile that was in Australia during the Ice Age that could hunt in the water like them, but can also hunt on land like the Komodo dragon. The quincana is a 10 to 30 foot long species of crocodile that shows adaptations for a terrestrial lifestyle, more so than those of the other crocodile species that are found in modern Australia. Along with that, they also have highly specialized set of teeth compared to any modern crocodile. Generally, crocodiles either have thick pointed teeth that are designed to pierce and crush, or they have needle-like teeth to help them to catch fish, but none would be able to cut up their food. The teeth of the quincana, however, have serrated knife-like teeth that could actually slice up the meat of their prey. Its teeth are more like that of theropod dinosaurs, more so than modern-day crocodiles. Along with crocodiles, Australia is also known for its snakes, especially the highly venomous species. During the Ice Age, there was one very curious species of snake that slithered throughout the outback. The Wanami snake is a snake that grew at a length of 13 to 20 feet long, and it was not a venomous species, rather it was a constrictor, like modern-day pythons and boas. However, unlike those species of snakes, or any modern species of snake, the Wanami snake actually didn't swallow their prey whole, at least not to the degree that modern snakes do. Instead, they either smaller prey that were smaller than their heads, or they actually use their teeth that are actually designed for cutting to rip their prey apart into smaller pieces that they could be able to swallow. Much like monitor lizards. This trait is found in their family of snakes known as the Matsodiids, a group of snakes that actually lived alongside the dinosaurs and even hunted dinosaur hatchlings. Another interesting fact is that this snake got its name from the Aboriginal language, and it's actually named by the Australian Aborigines that saw this snake when they first arrived in Australia, and they carry it on to this day. While these predators prowled on the land of the outback, there was one that actually hunted in the skies of Australia with the living wedge-tailed eagle. But it wasn't another species of eagle, but in fact a species that's more closely related to the old world vulture, called Dinatoides. There are two recognized species of them: Dinatoides gaffi, which is the larger of the two, with a wingspan of 10 feet long and weigh 26 pounds, and Dinatoides pachyosteius, that had a wingspan pretty much like that of a living wedge-tailed eagle, between 6 to 9 feet long, weighing between 5 to 12 pounds. Along with these two members of this genus, there is another species of vulture that was in Australia with them, called the cryptographs. Hope I pronounced that right. Which is around the size of the smaller Dinatoides species. While the two smaller species were possibly like how we know vultures and like hawks and eagles, but being more like vultures in the way of being scavengers, the larger species was definitely more like a predator. What it might not have been a large prey specials like the Haas eagle in New Zealand, their size of their talons proved this. The largest species of Dinatoides might have gone after the young of large mammals like Procoptodon and Diprotodon in ways very similar to that of eagles do today. We'll get to that later. Now, mind you, these are just like a small number of the Ice Age megafauna that lived during the Ice Age in Australia. And these and others I haven't mentioned here will be brought up as the video goes on. Keep an eye and ear out for that.
Now, if Australia had all of these fascinating, extraordinary megafauna, different type of animals, why we don't have them around today? That's always been one of the biggest scientific debates of all time, and I've actually covered it a bit in one of my rant videos. So if you want to check that out, I'll make sure there's a link in the description box or on the pop-up up here. But let's go over a little review on the causes of extinction.
A couple months ago, I talked about this whole topic on one of my Paleo-Zoo-Keeper rant videos. There will be a link in this video here. But to cut it short, the main theories for megafauna's extinction was climate change, human activities, or both. My conclusion that it was a combination of these two causes, that climate change, 46,000 years ago, has changed the environment immensely to the point that the megafauna became very limited in number and isolated to a few pockets that are agreeable to their needs. And this made them extremely vulnerable to localized events, especially from human activities, even if they've been coexisting together for thousands of years prior to this ordeal.
Now that we have a good idea of what caused the extinction of these megafauna, now, it begs the question, how do we develop a scenario where these animals don't become extinct, or at least survived up to recent times? Now, how do we develop that scenario in a realistic manner?
Well, like I said, I think that climate change had devastated the megafauna to the point that they were limited and isolated in a few locations in the whole continent. This would definitely make them pretty vulnerable to even localized events, but it could be argued that human activities would also be the most destructive to them at this stage. So, let's say for whatever reason in this scenario or alternate timeline, humans have not arrived to Australia when they did in our timeline, which is thought to be 65,000 years ago, and the megafauna did not have to deal with human activities when the climate changed their habitats. Now, when when would be a good time for the first people to arrive to the continent? This is important for what we know about the history of Australia and our planet. There are two other climatic events that would negatively affect the megafauna. The ending of the Ice Age that occurred around 19,000 years ago would have had negative effects on the megafauna when the last glacial maximum started 30,000 years ago. Temperatures drop and sea levels drop, which connected Australia to both Papua New Guinea, Tasmania, and some nearby islands, becoming the continent known as Sahulu, or Sahu. There are others, but I'll go with that name. The ending of the Ice Age made temperatures rise and sea levels went up, basically breaking apart Sahu to become Australia, Papua New Guinea, Tasmania, and several other islands, and even changed the environment immensely. During the time between the end of the Ice Age to the next big climatic event, it was actually wetter and warmer than it is today. I believe that one cannot deny that a good chunk of the megafauna would have benefited from the potential abundance of food in this climate. And it might have actually be a good time for humans to arrive on the continent and be able to coexist with the megafauna at this time. However, 5,000 years ago, there was a drying trend caused by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO for short. It pretty much started to affect the continent. It was often thought to be that it was this event, along with the arrival of the dingo, that wiped out the thylacine Tasmanian tiger and the Tasmanian devil from mainland Australia. This increase in aridity that this event caused was not constant. There were higher levels of precipitation between 3,500 to 28,000 years ago, and again from 2,100 years ago to 1,600 years ago. So these would need to be taken into account when humans could arrive to Australia and not accidentally wipe out the megafauna. But for the sake of this video, let's say that somehow between when things stabilized at the end of the Ice Age to around 3,000 years ago, the humans have arrived in Australia, and while their activities affected the megafauna at first, it wasn't to the point of them dying out, and they were able to actually coexist with each other.
Now that we have developed a scenario where these megafauna are able to survive, at least be able to survive up to recent times, what would it be like? Like, what would be at least at first, what would be the ecological applications of this whole thing? Like, how would it go? Or how is the ecosystem set up with these animals here?
One of the most obvious effects that the presence of the megafauna will have on the ecology is basically on vegetation. With the presence of large herbivorous megafauna in the landscape, their browsing and grazing activities will keep plants from growing out of control. When this happens, the grazing down of grasses and the browsing of trees and shrubs allow both a larger diversity of plants, making sure it's not only just a small number of species taking over and choking out other species, and by grazing down the grass and keeping the forest from being too dense and thick, also controls the amount of fuel for wildfires. The specific megafauna that would browse would include Diprotodon and Procoptodon, and the grazers would include species like Phasalonis gigas, and the Genionis would also will likely be a consumer of aquatic plants and would help keep the waterways from clogging up with or be overgrown by water plants. One curious effect comes from the Diprotodon. This is because, as mentioned earlier in this video, the Diprotodon is said to be the only marsupial that would actually migrate in large herds like wildebeest and bison. This will have ecological effects since the Diprotodon's migration will help keep an area from being overgrazed by them. They will be able to spread seeds far and wide through, well, their bowels or even by their fur, and their presence and absence due to their migrations would have effect on the local predators. And speaking of predators, the megafaunal predators would also have effects on the Australian ecology as well. As one would realize to be obvious, predators help keep the populations of herbivores in check so that they don't overpopulate and decimate the environment with their uncontrolled numbers. Also, predators do more for the ecology than just cutting down populations. Their hunting activities would also affect their prey's behavior as well. Predators generally stalk and hunt in areas where they are able to sneak up onto prey, like tall, thick grasses and dense forests, and would be able to actually find prey, like by sources of water and new growth. So, to try to avoid being ambushed, prey would generally try to avoid these areas if possible. But if they had to go to these sort of areas, like sources of water to get a drink, they will have to only stay there for a short period of time and then get out of there as quickly as possible. This sort of aversion both keeps prey from overfavoring or overbrowsing a specific area. For example, riparian areas or areas near water are very vulnerable to overgrazing by large herbivores. And when this happens, soil erosion increases and disrupts the quality of water, which will negatively affect the aquatic animals like frogs, insects, and of course, fish. This aversion also helps keep the herbivores from being too picky. In areas where predation is present, social animals will crowd up close to each other and graze or browse on what is good in general, not just spread out and only nitpick certain plants and avoid everything else. This keeps them from overfavoring specific plants, both affecting populations of those specific plants and help keep weeds from spreading. Think of it like making certain kids eat their broccoli rather than just the sweets. While this is a general rule of thumb for predators, how much and effective depends on the type of predators there are. What I mean is that things like size, physiology, and even metabolism can determine the predation pressure that each predator provides to the ecology. Size would often determine if they need a lot of food or so. For example, a 66-pound thylacine would not need as much food as a 250-pound thylacoleo would need. The physiology of the predator often determines destiny, and would often state what kind of prey a predator could catch. For example, a thylacine's physiology tells us that it generally prefers prey that are smaller than itself, whereas the thylacoleo is adapted to take on prey the same size or larger, generally larger, than itself. Also, thylacine tends to have better endurance than thylacoleo does, meaning that the thylacine could do decently on an endurance run in the open, whereas the pouched lion is an ambush predator and needs effective cover to get close enough to pounce on its prey. The metabolism of the predator can have a lot of ramifications on how the predator could affect the ecology. Whether the large predator is an ectotherm, cold-blooded, or endotherm, warm-blooded, can have implications on where they could hunt and how often. One of the things that Australia is known for, both in the past and present, is that it has a great diversity of reptiles. During the Ice Age, it had 3 or so large reptiles that were definitely in the category of meso or even apex predators. Apex predators are right up there on the top of the food chain. Meso predators are kind of like right underneath the apex predators. One benefit of being an ectotherm or cold-blooded predator is that you don't need to eat as often as like a warm-blooded or endothermic predator, and you can be able to survive without food for longer periods of time than birds or reptiles. Because of this efficiency, reptilian predators tend to have a higher population density than mammals of a similar weight in an ecosystem, with relatively low resources. However, there is a catch to this. Ectotherms rely on the environment to either warm or cool themselves down. And as an interesting fact, arch reptiles literally both take longer to warm up and just as long to cool down. Because of this, and with reptiles needing warmth to properly digest their food, large reptiles need to be in warm areas, like tropical or subtropical, and don't do well in areas that experience frost or snow. And the same thing will also go for their eggs as well. Endotherms might have more population densities than endotherms or warm-blooded animals, but endothermic predators, birds and mammals, tend to be more dominant in ecosystems due to them having more energy than the ectothermic animals, regardless of the outside temperatures. Having more energy and being able to maintain a constant warm body temperature in the elements, this allowed endotherms to be able to travel to colder areas, especially where frost or snow happens. So while the large giant reptilian predators would be more common and relatively be more dominant in warmer regions, mammalian and avian predators will still have advantages when it comes to things when things get cold, and they will be able to dominate colder areas as well. Also, while all predators are carnivores, not all carnivores are predators. Along with predators, there are also decomposers, or better known as scavengers. They would be the cleaners of the dead, where the animal died of natural causes, or was basically a hunter's leftovers, which keeps the landscape clean of carrion and will help limit the spread of carrion-borne diseases. Apex and mesopredators would usually take carcasses opportunistically. How often would depend on the competitive pressures from other predators and similar things like that. But there are those that specialize in the art. They range from the land-dwelling Tasmanian devils, from both the modern variety to the slightly larger species that's extinct in our timeline, to the large birds of prey, from the living wedge-tailed eagle to the extinct 3 species of vulturine raptors. As you can see, each species of megafauna had, or still has in this scenario, a place in the ecosystem where one helps the other, or that the effects of one affects the other, directly or indirectly. But what will happen when something or someone comes into the picture?
Now, along with the ecology, there's also how would the Australian Aborigines and the megafauna coexist? Like, how would that go out? Like I mentioned, that I don't really think that they were the main cause of the extinctions of the megafauna. But in a scenario where both are able to live side by side, how would that go?
In our timeline, humans came to Australia between 48,000 to 65,000 years ago. With recent with recent genetic research suggesting a more recent date closer to 50,000 years older. Older theories based on archaeological evidence suggest an arrival around 65,000 years ago. But whether it was one or the other, there is no doubt that humans had quite an effect on the local environment sometime after their arrival. As mentioned earlier in the video, and in one of my Paleo-Zoo-Keeper rant videos, especially the one in October, many scientists believe that humans had a hand in the extinction of the Ice Age megafauna, whether it was in hunting them or simply altering the landscape. My thoughts on it, and it's important in this video's case, is that the humans had an indirect hand in the extinction of the megafauna, but it was only when the climate and the environment changed to the point that it diminished the megafaunal populations and made them immensely vulnerable to even localized events. The best proof of this is evidence that shows that the people did coexist with the megafauna for thousands of years before these animals went extinct. In this case, the humans arrived later when the environment stabilized and the populations of the megafauna were in a good place. As long as the environment is balanced and the environment has not gone through any sort of change of what climate that has gone to the extreme, both humans and megafauna would be able to coexist quite peacefully. So, that it makes one wonder what it will be like for both the first Australians and the megafauna coexisting. What would it look like? A lot of people would say that they would just hunt the megafauna often for meat and various other things. It's not an unreasonable thought. In many places where there's large megafauna, people often or occasionally hunt megafauna since it would provide them with a lot of meat. From several African tribes going after large elephants and other giants, to Native American tribes that went for large prey, from bison to whales. However, while some groups and tribes might have done that every now and then, I severely doubt that the vast majority of them would do that on a regular basis, even if the megafauna has survived. This is because that when they did live with the megafauna in our timeline, there was no kill sites in relation to the people hunting megafauna ever found in Australia, like the mammoth kill sites that we found in North America. Any evidence of them eating megafauna is either scavenging from dead or dying animals, or going after the eggs of large birds, like that of Genionis. While I have explained on why that would be the case, I'll explain it again with a little bit extra into it. While humans can hunt megafauna if they want to, it is not without risk on multiple fronts. Killing an animal as large as a rhino is not the same as killing one the size of a rabbit. These animals will use their size and any other weaponry that they might have to defend themselves, especially if they had to deal with large predators. We'll get to that later. When dealing with an animal like that, you would need to kill it as fast as you possibly can, because the longer it takes, the more dangerous it gets, and the people in your group will be injured or killed. And in this scenario, you're doing it without guns or even with metal tools, just with wood and stone tools. Also, no horses, so you're basically doing this all on foot. Just that imagery alone should tell you that this whole situation is immensely dangerous. But even if you were able to kill the megafauna, either a slow death or a quick one, there are a couple challenges that comes afterwards. If you were to kill, say, a diprotodont, that's an animal that weighs around 6,000 pounds or 3 tons in US terms, and if that is if it was similar to that of modern large animals, a diprotodont carcass would yield probably around 2,400 to 3,100 pounds of meat, or around 1 to 1.5 tons of edible meat. Mind you, that's definitely enough to feed a tribe for a whole week. Well, it depends on the size of the tribe, and while that definitely sounds good, it would have issues. You can't just eat it all in one go, and you would need to preserve the rest of the meat, especially in hot areas where raw meat doesn't last long. While some Australian Aborigines do smoke and preserve their meat, most don't do that very often. This is generally because they are more focused on preserving plant food like grains and yams, more so than preserving meat. Plant food is generally easier to preserve without refrigeration than meat. Basically, like when we domesticated grains, it's much easier. That's why grain is often one of the most important factors of civilization. Anyway. And for the most part, they generally don't have a need to in a lot of places that because they have a lot of foodstuffs that are available due to their deep knowledge of the land. Also, with their fire stick farming practices, which means that they will use fire to alter the landscape when they need to, several of their favorite plants and favorite grazing prey are available in abundance. That's not to say they wouldn't preserve meat. The Australian Aborigines, these people are very innovative and have various ways of doing so, like drying meat, maybe curing them with salt, having them in honey, and even having them smoked. They just generally don't need to do that. Also, a kill that big would attract a lot of competition and trouble. Very unwanted competition and trouble. The first to arrive to such a kill would be the devils and birds of prey, whether by the devils smelling it out or the birds seeing the kill happening. These animals would definitely want to scavenge off of such a kill. These would most likely be easily kept at bay by humans. However, there are those who will be attracted to it that will not be easily spooked off. We don't have to worry about the thylacines. Thylacines are generally not scavengers, and they also could be scared off if they try. However, the Komodo dragon would definitely be tricky and a dangerous adversary in this scenario. We see this today on the islands of Komodo that when Komodo dragons smell blood, they go like sharks and will feast on any fleshy animal that they can overpower, whether it's a smaller member of their own species or even a dumb human that would just happen to be standing by. While one Komodo dragon would be manageable for a group of hunters, a mob of Komodo dragons would be immensely dangerous even to a group of hunters. And then you have the larger predators, like the Quincana, Megalania, and Thylacoleo. The Quincana, the terrestrial crocodile, with its crocodilian armor and dinosaurian teeth, and then you have the mammoth relative of the Komodo dragon, the Megalania, and then you have a marsupial predator that has the weaponry that make it look like a cross between a big cat and a bear. Oh boy. These predators would be the kind of predators that the people would definitely rather avoid and not get into conflict with to avoid injuries to themselves and their group. So I would say that while some tribes or groups might be able to hunt these megafauna on occasion, they would rather go after an emu or kangaroo that's big enough to feed the group, but small enough that they could just simply throw it over their shoulder and go to a safer location where they could be able to cook it fast and eat it fast too. However, like how they did in the Ice Age, the people would still scavenge off of a carcass whenever they have a chance, and will also go for the eggs of the larger birds. Hunting wouldn't be the only time or interaction that the people would have with the megafauna. As I mentioned before, the Australian natives use fire stick farming to manage the land. It's basically using fire to clear out areas and encourage new growth for their favorite plants and prey. This would have effects on the megafauna as well. Obviously, the fire would burn any animal that couldn't get out of the fire's way and would burn up plants that the megafauna would like to eat. However, the fires do provide fertilizer for the plants when the rains come about. Such plants would include grasses that grazing animals like modern kangaroos and Pascalonis gigas would love when they grow back vigorously. These grasses would provide food for termites, which will provide food for the echidnas, both the modern small ones and the giant Ice Age ones. Plants called bush tomatoes will be loved by both the people and animals. The omnivorous kangaroo, Prop- Propleopus, might be one of them. Any trees and shrubs that would recover from the fires provide fresh green leaves for the browsing animals such as Diprotodont and Procoptodon. Also, the fires, when they kill animals or scare them out of their hiding, would be a good opportunity for predators and scavengers to go after frightened animals or already cooked carcasses, provided they themselves don't get burned in the process. Interestingly enough, with the large megafaunal herbivores still in the environment, their constant grazing and browsing would help decrease the amount of fire fuel in the environment, and would help make fires, either natural or man-made, not be as intense as it would be without them there. Of course, just like any large animal in human culture, the Aborigines would definitely have stories on them. They would pretty much use the imagery of them in their stories as like lessons about morals, the environment, life, and the origin of their natural world. They will have a fearful respect of those who are powerful and dangerous, from the Diprotodont to the Thylacoleo. In our timeline, they already have stories of these creatures in their Dreamtime stories, but they would probably seem less mythical in our alternate scenario. Since the megafauna are still around, it'll be less likely that they would add any mythical elements to their tales, to a degree. For example, in one of their Dreamtime stories, one giant lizard that ate people that most likely would be inspired by Megalania. However, it was given a third pair of limbs in the story. Just like in many parts of the world, the people and the animals would live together through a constant struggle of life. While it would not be very easy, there will be some ups and downs. So they would have a balance. However, just like in our timeline, this balance is not going to be there for long.
Now, the next scenario was going to be very interesting. When Europeans first come to the continent of Australia. As everyone would know, this is where things get pretty interesting.
Now, on a side note, while this continent has been isolated for a long time, the Australian Aborigines are not that isolated from outside Australia as one would think. They've actually had a bit of a two-way regular trade and travel between Australia and Southeast Asia that predated the arrivals of Europeans that came to the island continent centuries ago. By centuries, I mean. This is not only where the Aborigines were able to get some goods like some cloth and tobacco, but it's also how they got dingoes. We'll talk about their relation with the megafauna later in this video, and even how like some of them were able to learn to speak English before the British arrived. While it would be uncertain what the effects would be in that deal in this scenario, it could be possible that southeastern sailors who traded with the Aborigines would have tales of the strange beasts of the land, especially if the giant reptiles are thought of as dragons. They could probably have the nickname as Land of Dragons. But like I said, it's uncertain at this point in relation to the megafauna. Despite what we would think, the British were not the first Europeans to discover Australia and its nearby islands. The first Europeans to reach Australia were the Dutch, especially with a man named William Janszon. Here's basically how it's spelled. Making the first recorded landing in 1606 on the Cape York Peninsula. He charted about 200 miles of coastline doing this expedition. A few months later, a Spanish explorer, Luis Vaz del Torres, again, here's how his name was, sailed through the strait between Australia and New Guinea, which now bears his name, but did not land on the mainland. As time went on, the Dutch would have other expeditions on the western and southern coasts of Australia, but they never brought any permanent settlements there. Then, on April 1770, Captain James Cook arrived on the Australian shores and claimed the land for the British Crown. As one could imagine, just like in our timeline, these explorers would talk about these strange creatures when they arrived to Europe. And just like in our own timeline, their audiences would be startled by these accounts, even to the point of thinking that they simply, made it all up. I mean, could you blame them? Without context or prior knowledge, would you believe in tales of turtles that had the heads and tails of dragons, a crocodile that hunted on the land, lizards so large they could be mistaken for dragons, or giant rabbit-like beasts that walked like people? And this is not even mentioning the living platypus and kangaroos. There is one thing that explorers and eventual colonists would bring that we probably don't even think about. What would they be named? Obviously, the natives of Australia already have names for their animals, of course. And since they had names for them, in our timeline, we will have a good idea what some of them are here. The Diprotodon was given the name Yamati from tribes that lived in the Flinders Ranges. The name of Yari was said to be the name of the Thylacoleo in several tribes. And the monstrous Hui of some Dreamtime stories was, from my interpretation, possibly the name for the Megalania. That's basically from the tribes of the Tongala River, also known as the Murray River. The Bunyip, name of a feared monster of their Dreamtime stories, would be the name for either Diprotodon or any other Australian megafauna. In our timeline, I can imagine. In our timeline, the Wanami and Quincana both got their names from the Australian Aboriginals, and I have no doubt that it'll be the same in this alternate scenario. When the British arrive and eventually start colonizing the continent, you can imagine them trying to come up with names for the animals of this new continent. In our timeline, a lot of Australian animals have their names derived from the names that the Australian Aborigines gave them. Best example of this are kangaroo, koala, wombat, numbat, dingo, kookaburra, bilby, and so on. But at the same time, a lot of other Australian animals get their names, modern names, from Europeans from elsewhere, such as the platypus, which actually derived from a Greek word. Bandicoot actually came from a word from India. Possum, which is actually a Native American name for the opossum of North America, basically taking the O out to make an Australian version of it. And there's also the Tasmanian Devils. With their screamings, enough said. With this in mind, we could definitely imagine the various names that they would give these megafauna. As I mentioned, they could give them names that the Aborigines would give them, like the Wanami snake, Quincana crocodile, Megalania being called the Hui, and so on. Or they could be given their own name for it, like the Quincana could probably be called the bear croc for its terrestrial lifestyle. They'll call the Megalania, the dragon tortoise for its dragon-like head. Maybe call the Procoptodon, the giant Harpoca, pouch hare in Old English, and eventually call them or at least some a humanoid rabbit, since they have a rabbit-like head and they walk on their hind legs. And the Diprotodon will probably be called the pouch buffalo or bison, since they're huge and they will migrate in large herds like the buffalo or bison of North America. On scientific names, it would depend on the circumstances of when and what the scientists observe when categorizing these animals. In our timeline, they base their scientific names on what the fossils revealed to them, or what they think they revealed to them, and where the fossils were found or who found them. In this alternate scenario, the scientists would have a lot to go on, such as like animals' behaviors, their colorations, their favorite habitats, and how they interact with people. So there would be a chance that they might go after different scientific names for these megafauna based on this. For example, we call the Thylacoleo so because it's a marsupial that's similar to a big cat, and lions are often thought to be the king of beasts, so it would make sense, especially since they had only the bones to go for. However, with the Thylacoleo, if the Thylacoleo lived up to recent times and had stripes or rosettes, it's basically like a form of spots, it would have been called different names. Like, if it had stripes, it will probably be called Thylacotigris, or if it had spots or rosettes, it could be called a Thylacoana, or a Thylacobardus, first one for jaguar and second for leopard. Or Thylacopanthera if it had a black coat, or it might even be called something like a Dinosaurus. Hope I pronounced it right. Or the terrible squirrels. It could probably have a more squirrel-like appearance if its fur and tail are similar to that of a squirrel. This is just one of the unique differences of how megafauna would be viewed if they lived up to recent times, compared to how we would see it in our own timeline. To make it simple for you, the viewer, and myself, I'll just continue to call the animals by the names that we have given them in our timeline throughout the whole video. Now, when these European sailors first arrive on Australia and they see these animals, what would they do after being weirded out by them and trying to comprehend what they are? Well, they would eat them. Now, this is not just for the usual humans eat everything on sight reasoning. These men have been sailing for months on end on open sea and basically were surviving on nothing but preserved foods like salted meat and hardtack, which is, in case any of you don't know, is a type of bread that's kind of like a cracker. That is as hard as a brick. And they would definitely like to get some more fresh food when they get to land. It's kind of like if you've been on a car drive that lasted for like 4 or 5 hours, and once you get to a gas station, not only you get to fill up your truck, but you also get to finally get some more fresh food. And it's not just for like the usual, we want food that's better, but it's also for rational health reasons, like for example, if you don't get enough fresh fruit or similar foodstuffs, you'll be able to succumb to scurvy. And anyone who's ever dealt with scurvy, or at least knows their history about it, you definitely would know that it's not a good condition to have. And from what we were able to understand in our timeline, Captain James Cook and his men were able to gather fish, shellfish, ducks, quail, pigeon, cockatoos, and any edible plants they were able to gather once they got to Australia to feed themselves and stock themselves. In our alternate timeline, would they hunt the megafauna that they would find at that time? Well, yeah, they could and they would. They did carry muskets that would be able to help kill at least one of these gigantic animals, and the meat would be able to feed the 94 men that Captain James Cook crews consist of. If you, for example, fed like 1 pound of meat per man, that would be 94 pounds to feed in one meal. And we know that Diprotodont, for example, had between 1 ton to 1.5 tons of meat, and that would definitely feed the men for over a month. And if they wanted to, they could be able to feed the men enough fresh meat for like a meal or two, and be able to cure or salt the rest of the meats for the rest of their journey. But if you were to ask what particular megafauna of Australia would have been the most important to these explorers at the time, I would definitely have to say that the Megafauna would definitely be the most important one that Captain James Cook and his crew would have loved. I would definitely say that Megafauna would be an important animal for Captain James and his crew, because throughout our own timeline, and even with our own timeline's versions of this crew, Giant land tortoises of various islands, like those of the Galapagos, were valued for that they could be able to be kept in the hall, not need to be fed or given water for months, and they could be able to provide fresh meat throughout the trip. Mealania would definitely be no different, and it would actually provide a little bit more meat since it has that long tail. I can imagine that Captain James Cook's crew would that when they leave the east coast of Australia, they would depart with a large number of Mealania, if they're able to find enough of them, in their cargo hold, and use them as a source of fresh meat for months on end. Anyway, after Captain James Cook's arrival to Australia, other British ships came aboard to set up shop on this new continent. The first colony established was a penal colony called Sydney, in a turf of land that Captain James Cook called, from his first arrival there, New South Wales. As time went on, more penal colonies were established across the continent. Reason for this is that the prisons in Britain were getting overcrowded, so it might be best to take the criminals elsewhere. Also, they would need to establish colonies onto Australia so that they can stake their claim to the continent. So to the British, it was like a two birds in one stone situation. Some penal colonies, which in case you don't know, a penal colony is basically a colony, that's mostly a prison, were actually surprisingly decent to the prisoners to the point that they could get a second chance in life. But some were not so great and were rather brutal. You can imagine that many convicts would try to escape from these harsher colonies, either by trying on boat to get back to England, or escaping the Australian bush. In our timeline, escapes to the outback were not very successful due to the harsh environment. In our alternate scenario, while the environment would probably still be harsh, it would even be more dangerous due to the presence of the megafaunal predators that would be roaming about. I can imagine that several of these predators, like the Komodo dragon, would take advantage of these prisoners who would get lost, weakened by not being able to find enough food, or track them down if one of them was bleeding. With this imagery alone, you can imagine that this would make prisoners not exactly want to consider even trying to escape to the outback unless they were completely desperate, suicidal, or downright stupid. I wouldn't be surprised if their jailers would use this as a selling point to discourage anyone from trying to escape their penal colonies.
Now, as European colonists start moving to Australia and start spreading out for Australia, they and the whole world gets more and more fascinated with these unique creatures. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, in our timeline, Australia already has very fascinating creatures there anyway. Now you get that, multiply that by 10 or 100-fold with all these Australian megafauna, you definitely know that this is definitely going to get people's fascination, curiosity, and imaginations going wild.
You can definitely bet that these creatures would have been hunted or captured by people from around the world. Obviously, the British zoos and those from other countries would have a big demand for these creatures for their collections. Just like how the trade of wild exotic animals was a very lucrative trade in our timeline, from today to even as far as back as the Victorian era, the trade of these megafaunal animals would definitely be no different. Along with zoological parks, many of these megafauna can also be traded to private hands as well. According to the book I read called The Tiger That Swallowed the Boy, Exotic Animals in Victorian England, it was immensely common for the upper class to purchase and privately own exotic animals as a form of a status symbol, since having an exotic animal or several of them would show that you have a lot of money, especially since buying them and keeping them, especially large carnivores, would not be cheap. Also, circuses were also being interested in taking these creatures for not just their menageries, but probably to contribute them into their acts. I can imagine that a lion tamer would try to test his skills on a thylacoleo, although I severely doubt that such techniques would work that well on this marsupial. However, it is a sad fact that during this century, animals in such situations were kept in barren environments of cement and iron bars. While they made certain that the animals were fed, it was not very well understood about the special needs of wild animals that we know today, such as providing them browse, providing them places to hide, or giving them enrichment. So many of these animals would definitely be suffering from what are basically cold and dark, hard dungeons and would display a lot of behavioral abnormalities. We've actually seen this with the thylacine or Tasmanian tigers in our historical records. Two of the stereotypical behaviors or behavior abnormalities they displayed in a stressful environment would be pacing and biting the bars of their cage. In this alternate timeline, the thylacine would suffer these same things, and I would not be surprised if the thylacoleo itself would also suffer from the same thing too. This would change as time goes on, but it's not until much later throughout this timeline, and we'll get to that later in the video. However, I could imagine that people that look at these animals in these collections will probably be inspired by these creatures and will come up with ideas and even fictional characters based off of them. Like, for one fun thought, what if the White Rabbit of the Alice in Wonderland, or Alice into the Looking Glass, was replaced by Procoptodon, or it's based off of Procoptodon because when we think about it, a Procoptodon looks like a bipedal kangaroo, a bipedal rabbit. So I can definitely imagine that instead of the White Rabbit of Wonderland, it would be the white rabbit-faced kangaroo of Wonderland. While zoos and menageries will collect these animals for attractions, the scientific community would also be collecting these megafauna for their studies and research. They would categorize and name these animals in ways that they understand. They would be categorizing their bones, dissecting their carcasses, and even placing their fetuses in jars of ethanol for years to come. I could imagine that the scientists of our timeline would kill to be in this alternate timeline, observing and even assisting in these. I could also even imagine that when Charles Darwin arrived in Sydney Harbor on January 12, 1836, he would be observing and writing down notes about the megafauna that he would likely see on his 2-month stay. Also, there is one interesting possibility that the Procoptodont and similar kangaroos might influence the scientific view of another group of extinct animals that died long before even its time, the dinosaurs. Now, in our timeline, paleontologists or scientists at the time use living kangaroos, like modern gray and red kangaroos, as models for bipedal dinosaurs, as in standing upright and dragging their tails when they moved, even though there's no evidence of them doing that in their trackways. With the short-faced kangaroos, recent evidence has shown, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that they walked rather than hopped, and they either walked like humans, or they pretty much walked how we imagine two-legged dinosaurs to walk, which all did it without dragging their tails. Maybe, especially with the short-tailed kangaroo's gait being more balanced than we expect of a kangaroo's gait, it might actually help science be a little further ahead on this than in our timeline. However, while this scientific work is being done, there is a sort of scientific prejudice that was rising up that would negatively affect the marsupial megafauna of Australia, as well as those in Tasmania and Papua New Guinea. This scientific prejudice is basically the idea that marsupials are considered inferior to placental mammals. The reason was that scientists at the time considered the reproductive strategy of marsupials to be considered primitive. Other reasons would include, but not be limited to, the perceived lack of diversity, although this might be challenged with the presence of the megafauna. Their smaller brain size, the fact that marsupials were quote-unquote being outcompeted elsewhere in the world, or even just a human-centered bias, especially since humans are placentals as well, and we are considered superior. One unfortunate side effect of this prejudice is that it made marsupials seem boring and uninteresting for proper scientific study. This was basically why scientific studies on the thylacine, for example, back when they were alive, was so limited, and any studies of them were only picked up right after their extinction. We now know that it might actually be the marsupials that are the more evolved ones, but both that's still debated on, and even if it were, it would have been a long time before that was even known.
While people in the British homeland and scientific minds have their own thoughts, opinions, and whatnot of these magnificent animals, the people who are living there with those animals, the settlers who are dealing with these animals in this new land, they got their own thoughts and opinions on these animals.
Now, mind you, while the colonization of Australia initially started as by simply establishing penal colonies, free men start coming over to Australia for a new opportunity. As these colonies grew, self-sufficiency was encouraged, promoting a private sector and an export-based economy to reduce the costs for Britain. With large land grants and free convict labor available in Australia, wealthy immigrants came about to settle. As this continued, free settlements started to become more established there. Free as in there are no convicts in these settlements, even as labor. Also, as the 19th century went on, the transport of convicts to Australia decreased until it pretty much ended in 1868. As people started colonizing Australia in greater numbers and further inland, the interaction between them and the megafauna would increase. As one would expect, the colonists and settlers would have negative encounters with the predators, especially at night when they sleep, and the hunters that could stalk in the night will take any opportunity that lies there. Now, mind you, not all the megafaunal predators will go after prey at night. One such predator would be the Komodo dragon. In modern times, and especially in our timeline, Komodo dragons are primarily diurnal and would be inactive during the night. This is due to colder temperatures at the night, and with them being ectotherms, so this would definitely affect them. However, isn't always the case. For example, I believe that both the Megalania and Quencana could be nocturnal when needed. Now, I know that you guys are wondering why Megalania could do it, but Komodos couldn't. Now, remember when I said earlier in the video that the larger the reptile, the longer it would take for them to warm up and cool off? Well, Megalania's large size, especially compared to Komodo dragon, would definitely help it keep warmth in its body for a longer period of time, and this would be able to help it hunt for a while, using its sense of smell to help track down resting prey before it needed to rest. The same thing goes with large crocodilians as well, even with the living saltwater crocodile. The Wanami snake would definitely be a danger for children or even adults for its large size and constriction. However, just like with modern large snakes, the Wanami wouldn't be able to swallow a human, young or old. However, the Wanami could technically be able to eat humans, but not by swallowing them whole, but instead using its teeth to rip the meat off the prey's body, much like Komodo dragons would. And much like a lot of species of pythons, the Wanami would have nocturnal habits. And a lot like other mammalian predators in other lands, the thylacoleo would definitely be hunted at night or at dawn and dusk. They would be cautious at first, but when humans are asleep or it gets too comfortable or familiar with humans, it would definitely hunt humans. If they get injured and learn that humans are easy prey, they would become man-eaters, much like how big cats would in Africa and Asia. So there are dangers to the Australian settlers in the dark, but there are also still many dangers to them in the day. While some predators would consider the night or at certain seasons and locations, They would still hunt in the daylight at times, and the Komodo dragons would definitely be more active in the daytime. Along with predators, herbivores could also provide a danger to humans as well. One that I would probably very confidently say would definitely be a danger to humans is the diprotodont. One of the biggest forms of evidence that we have of this is that it's actually some of the Dreamtime stories of the Aborigines. In some of their stories, the diprotodont, or the Yamati, was a dangerous and fearful animal, so much so that when the sun sets, the kids should be set to sleep so that they don't go off into the bush. This story makes sense. Would make sense of the diprotodont's danger. Modern-day wombats would be pretty nasty when they feel like it, using their teeth to bite people and predators. Then we have a wombat as big as a rhino. That's basically a terrifying thought. Also, in hot areas, herbivores would graze and browse at night because it's cooler and more comfortable. Also, on the islands of Komodo, the prey animals would take advantage of the Komodo dragon's primarily diurnal habits and become more nocturnal to avoid these lizards. Probably would be the same for diprotodont. Also, in Africa, hippos and other large herbivores are more responsible for human deaths than even the predators are. This is due to their predatory and protective nature. It would definitely make sense for diprotodonts since they're not built for running and will have no choice but to fight when a predator comes about. So if anyone accidentally stumbled upon a diprotodont and surprised it, you could definitely expect that the diprotodont would fight to the death at all costs.